Hello and welcome to the next lesson in Gathering and Processing Techniques for Advanced Higher Geography. And today what we're going to be looking at is something called an Environmental Quality Survey. So before we get started, it's important to outline the aims of the lesson. And as always, there are three aims when we're looking at the methods in Advanced Higher Geography. First of all, obviously we want to find out how to properly conduct an environmental quality survey. That's the primary aim really of this lesson, so that if you decided at some point in the future that you wanted to conduct an environmental quality survey, or EQS for short, that you'd be able to do it and do it well. So that's the first aim. The second aim is, what's the point? Why would you want to do it? To be able to recognise the sort of scenarios, the research questions that would require an EQS, an environmental quality survey, to be carried out. So what's the point in doing it? Why would we want to conduct an environmental quality survey? And then finally, as always, we will look at the advantages of this particular technique, but also the considerations the things we need to think about before we go and do an EQS, and also what are the limitations of the method as well. What are the negatives of it, the drawbacks of it? A bit of background information here about an environmental quality survey and what really it's all about before we get into the nuts and bolts of this technique. Obviously, when we're talking about the environment, we're talking about everything around us, and as geographers we are interested in the physical elements of our world, rivers, vegetation, open space, mountains, hills and so on, but we're also very interested in the human elements of our world. Infrastructure, buildings, towns, villages, roads, railways, and so on and so forth. And geography really is about taking all of these things together and seeing how we as human beings interact with our natural environment. Now, what an environmental quality survey does is it takes all of those elements of the environment together and considers them in trying to make a judgment about how good a particular area, the environment of a particular area is. What is the quality of that particular environment? So if we were to look at an area in a particular town or village, we might consider how aesthetically pleasing that area is. How nice does it look? Does it have a good look about it? Does it look pleasant? But not just that, there are other things that are considered too in a particular location, the environment of a particular location. We might think about pollution. Is it noisy? Is there a lot of noise pollution? Is there a lot of traffic fumes as well? So we'd consider that. Is there a lot of litter? Is there a lot of vandalism? Are things in pretty good order? Are things being well maintained? Are buildings well maintained? Or are they looking a bit run down? Are there derelict buildings, for example? We might also consider the standard of amenities as well. We might say, well, the services aren't so great here. There's maybe not good street lighting, perhaps. There's a lack of public transport and so on. So all of those things taken together, we can look at a whole range of physical and human factors in a particular environment. And the environmental quality survey is a way of judging the quality of the environment, how good the environment is when we take a range of these factors and these characteristics together. So I've got a wee task for you now before I tell you a little bit more about this particular method, and it's to think about these following questions. I'd like you to pause the lesson here and really think about these next two questions. The first one there is, when would it be useful to use an environmental quality survey, or EQS as they're referred to? When would it be appropriate to use it? When would it be useful to use it? So I've already outlined the fact that essentially what the EQS is doing is it's trying to measure the standard of an environment in a particular area, how good the environment is in a particular area, or otherwise, of course. So that might be an area of a town or a village or a city, where we kind of look at the characteristics of that particular environment, that particular area, and make a judgment about how good it is, what the standard of it is. When would it be useful to do that? What sort of projects might be involved in using an EQS? So something to think about there. But the other thing I'd like to think about as well is how would we do it? What do you think it involves? So if we are, measuring or attempting to measure the quality of the environment, well, how on earth are we going to do that? What sort of technique, what will the technique possibly involve doing? And that's what I'd like you to think about before we move on. The reason I want you to do that is that thinking about your learning in this way can actually really help to deeply ingrain an understanding of the technique, or deeply ingrain an understanding of whatever you're learning. Thinking about it, ruminating over it in some way can really, really help. So that's what I'd like to challenge you to do. And if you pause the video for a few minutes to allow you to do that, in the next few slides I will go over the technique and essentially answer these two questions for you. Okay, so what I'm going to tell you now are some of the reasons why you would do an environmental quality survey, to sort of answer the first question on the previous slide. And this is not an exhaustive list. There are other ways in which the EQS could be used to answer geographical questions, but there are 4 bullet points here that I would like you to have in your notes as good examples of where the EQS can be applied to increase our geographical understanding of a particular human environment. The first one there is to identify problems. For example, problems in an urban area or damage in an urban area. So an EQS can be used to look at an area and see if buildings are in poor repair, if there are buildings which are derelict, which are in need of a little bit of TLC. Is the road in poor quality? Are pavements in poor quality? Is there a large amount of traffic affecting noise pollution, air pollution? Are there a lack of services? Are there not very many shops or other services in an area? So the EQS is very effective at measuring any damage or any problems within a particular urban area. The second bullet point tells us, of course, that the EQS can also provide that background information that is required by planners to solve some of these problems. So it informs planners, it informs decision makers about the condition of the environment, which then allows them to make the necessary interpretations and the necessary plans in order to solve those issues, or identify what needs to be done to solve those issues. So if you've discovered that there are a lot of derelict buildings, it may be that the local authority says, right, okay, we need to invest in this area, we need to improve the quality of housing in this area, we need to improve the quality of the pavements or the roads in this area. If the traffic is really bad, there's a lot of congestion, for example, then that can allow planners to look at traffic flow, the need to put pedestrian crossings in place, or and so on and so forth. So it basically allows a measurement of the quality of the environment in the area, which then informs future decision making and allows people to make interpretations about the best way forward to deal with those particular problems. And in that bullet point, it really shows, again, the usefulness of a lot of these geographical methods that we're looking at. We're not just measuring an environmental quality survey to be nosy or to just because we're interested in it, and that's fine to be interested in it, but often, and almost always in fact, these techniques that I'm telling you about have a real usefulness. We can use them to improve the environment, to improve people's lives. We could also use them in comparative studies. So we could compare the environmental quality in 2 areas or more. And remember, I've mentioned this before, that when we're doing a geographical study, which you will be expected to do for your advanced higher geography, it's always much more powerful to have a comparative study, to look at 2 different areas, or to compare areas seasonally as well. So comparing over time or comparing over space is always really informative in geography. And the examples I've used here is going back to our Burgess model again. We could look at different zones of the city. What is the environmental quality of the area like in the central business district compared to the inner city or compared to the suburbs? And are there any areas of a city which need a wee bit of TLC, a bit of investment in? We could also do it for different villages. So you could look at villages in a particular district which villages are more aesthetically pleasing with higher quality buildings, better services or higher quality services, and so on and so forth. That can be quite an informative study as well. We could do the same for tourist resorts, places which are popular for tourists, which are, how are they impacted by tourism, which I'll talk about in a second, and also different shopping areas. So what shopping areas are perhaps more attractive for investors or for consumers. And then the final bullet point there is to consider the impact of certain features on the quality of the environment. So I alluded to this a second ago with the impact of tourism. For example, the effect of tourism. So we obviously have many areas in Scotland which are, they're very attractive to tourists. Think about the Isle of Skye at the moment is a great example where there's lots of people coming to visit Skye, much more than there were maybe 10 or 15 years ago. What's the impact of tourism in particular areas of the country? If we went to some of the main villages on Skye, if we went to Portree, for example, do we see the impact of tourism? You could look at that seasonally, couldn't you? You could look at the environmental quality in Portree at the height of the tourist season, and then you could look at it again in the winter. Would traffic be different? Would litter be different? Would there be more services which were shut down or mothballed? Things like that. That can be quite informative. And furthermore, we could look at the impact of industry as well. If there's a factory in close proximity, in an area, does that impact the environmental quality of that particular area? If there are a lot of shops, if you're in a shopping area, how does that compare? Different types of shopping areas compare in terms of the effect on the environmental quality. So many options there for applying an EQS and finding out about the particular environment, the particular area that we're looking at. So what does the methodology involve then? How does it work? How do we carry out an environmental quality survey? Well, to do an environmental quality survey, you need a recording sheet. We use a recording sheet to do it. And I've got an example of a recording sheet here. It won't always look like this, but what it has is a range of categories down the side, which have been skillfully and deliberately chosen by the researcher as the factors, the characteristics of the environment that are going to be used to paint an overall picture of the environmental quality of a particular area. So in this case, as you can see, the researcher is interested in looking at the quality of the housing, how much traffic there is, how much derelict land there is, how noisy it is, whether there's litter and vandalism or whether it's clean and tidy, and so on. So a range of characteristics there. Now what you'll also see is there are some columns in the middle there, numbered 1 to 5. Now this is how we quantify the quality of the environment. We make a judgment as to how good or poor the environment is, and we give it a score from 1 to 5. 5 being the best, 1 being the worst, 3 obviously being in the middle, being kind of neutral. So you'll make a decision, you'll make a judgment call, and you will put a tick in the appropriate column. At the end, once you've done that for each category, you will give the environment an overall total score. And obviously, in this case, the higher the total, the better quality the environment is. So for example, you might go to your particular area, part of the city that you're looking at, or part of a town that you're looking at, and just to take one of the categories, you might have a wee look around and you could see, oh, dearie me, there's a wee bit of rubbish on the floor. Somebody's been, dropping a sandwich wrapper or whatever on the floor there. But apart from that, it's pretty good. So it's not perfect. A wee bit of rubbish, but somebody will pick that up soon enough, so we'll give it a 4. Or you might go to a different area and it's a complete state. There's graffiti all over the walls, there's dog's dirt on the floor, there's bins coped over with rubbish strewn all over the floor. And in that case, you'd say, oh dear, it was very poor, a lot of litter, a lot of vandalism, I'm going to have to score this one a 1. So you do that for each category, make your judgment on each of those, add up the score, and that total will give you a quantified number. It quantifies the quality of the environment, and you can then use that score and compare it with other areas. What's the environmental quality like for different areas? Okay, so I want to give just a wee bit more information about how this methodology actually works. Now, as I said in the previous slide, what you'll do is that for each of your carefully chosen locations for your environmental quality survey, you are going to turn up at that area and you are going to score all of your chosen categories. All of the categories that you've chosen, you're going to assign a score for them. However, in geographical fieldwork, it's always beneficial to work as a group. For safety reasons, you should never be going out doing fieldwork on your own. You should always have somebody with you. And if you're doing group work, if there's a few of you, then the benefit of that is that you can ensure that people are doing their environmental quality survey, for example, in different parts of a town at the same time, simultaneously. Because one of the considerations may be that traffic could change at different times of the day. So if you're doing an EQS comparing different parts of a settlement, it's always beneficial to be having people do it simultaneously at the same time. That would be ideal. That would be a fantastic situation for ensuring that you had a rigorous study. But there is a problem there, because if different people are doing an environmental quality survey, there is always the risk that their perception, it is a perception study this, but their perception of what is good quality might be different from somebody else's, might be different from yours. So it is therefore essential when you're conducting group work that you calibrate your judgments. In other words, you have to speak with the other participants, the people who are doing the environmental quality survey with you, and saying, right, what is our judgment going to be on measuring these standards? What are we going to say is roughly a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 4 or a 5 for these categories? So that takes a bit of time beforehand, but it's absolutely essential in ensuring that you have a rigorous and accurate environmental quality survey for comparing these different areas. When you go and do your survey, the location of the survey where you're conducting it has to be carefully recorded, either on a map and, I would suggest, on your recording sheet as well, perhaps by writing down the name of the street or a grid reference if that's not possible. And the reason for that is that in science it's always important to record these sorts of details, because a good scientific project and a good method section will make it clear what you've done and where you've been, to allow somebody to come after you and replicate your study to see if they can get the same results or if anything's changed. So you must always record the location of your survey. Now, as I said before, what you do is once you've looked at all your categories and made your judgment in terms of the standard, the quality of the environment for each of those, or how good or poor they are, you then will total up the score of all these indicators to give it an overall number to indicate the quality of the environment at that location. And then you repeat that process at different locations as well to allow comparisons to be made. Now, as you're doing all that, what you'll also want to do is you'll want to take any observations that you see at the time. And on most recording sheets, a good recording sheet will have a wee space at the bottom to allow you to make those sorts of comments. Was there something going on at the time which you need to talk about? Was there a traffic jam, for example? Was there some sort of market going on or some sort of event going on which may have affected some parts of your EQS? Or any interesting observations that you've seen. It's always important to put those observations down, because you never know what could become useful later on when you're analysing your results. And also photographs. Take photographs of a particular area too. Photographs are really useful. If you've done an environmental quality survey and you're doing a report on it, writing a study about it, you want to be able to illustrate what you've seen with the use of photographs to back up perhaps the judgments you've made. So if you've seen a bit of graffiti or there's a lot of litter lying about in a particular area, take a photograph of that. That can be used in a results section as well. That can help to illustrate your findings. An example I've got here, this photograph here, is from a place called Calafinisterre in the southeast of Spain, and we've got a thoroughfare here which is sometimes used for markets. And we carried out an environmental quality survey here with some students, and you might be able to see that there's a little bit of graffiti on the walls, things like that. There's in fact a little bit of rubbish lying about too. So this photograph here can be used to illustrate that, to justify some of the scores that you have used or applied to each indicator, to each factor. Another thing that I've mentioned here is field sketches. Now, field sketches are a very useful geographical tool in which you do a quick drawing of the area. It doesn't have to be something that's going to be hanging up in an art gallery. It doesn't have to be sort of Van Gogh quality or anything like that. Just a quick utilitarian, useful sketch of what you can see. Perhaps in this case, you would draw the wall, the vegetation, which obviously has a beneficial effect on the aesthetics in this photograph here. There's a tall building in the distance. You would quickly sketch those things in, annotate those. The purpose of doing a field sketch can be actually very useful before you do your environmental quality survey. Because what a field sketch will do when you turn up at a particular location is it makes you stop and really look at the environment around you. When you're quickly sketching it and annotating it, it's forcing you to make observations. And sometimes when people rush in and they just dive straight into an environmental quality survey without really getting their eye in, really looking at the environment, you can miss things, and that will affect the quality of your survey. It will reduce the accuracy of your survey because it means you might miss important things that could affect the level of scoring that you would assign to a particular characteristic. So doing a field sketch at the start is a really, really useful way to get your eye in, to get you into the zone, if you like. Okay, so some of the advantages of this technique. I'm going to give you 3 major advantages of this technique for your notes. But I think we could probably think of more if we really needed to. But these are 3 that I think are the most pertinent ones. The first one is to do with the type of data that we are collecting here. We are using clear categories when we're doing an environmental quality survey, and we are generating numerical data. Now, because we're doing that, we can afterwards conduct statistical analysis of the data that we have collected, of the information that we have collected, which is very powerful when we're making comparisons. So because we've got that numerical data, we can carry out certain statistical techniques which can determine whether there is a statistically significant difference in the quality of environment in different parts of, say, a city or in different villages or whatever. And that always, when you conduct statistical analysis, it always makes a study more powerful and more valuable. So later on in the course, I'm going to tell you a wee bit more about these sort of statistical analyses that we can apply to our data, we can apply when we're doing geographical analysis, but that is a major advantage of an environmental quality survey. The other advantage is that we can use a wide range of categories to establish the quality of the environment, and we can be quite flexible with those as well. We can add in certain ones which we think will be informative. For example, traffic, housing, vandalism, and that can allow us to really build up a very detailed picture of the quality of an area. And finally as well, we've got primary data which is collected, and that primary data is therefore up to date and it's reliable because we can vouch for its accuracy. We know it's up to date because we've just carried it out recently, but also we can consider the limitations, the considerations that I'm going to talk about in a second to ensure that our study is as accurate as possible. Okay, so considerations and limitations of the technique. Now, as you have probably worked out, the main limitation and the main thing that has to be considered when doing an EQS is the fact that the scoring that you are applying to each category is based on opinion, is based on judgment. So an individual's opinion and judgment can vary, and therefore this technique is open to subjectivity, and it is difficult to ensure accuracy in these sorts of studies. So that is something that needs to be very carefully considered. An example of some of the judgments that you can have, the judgments that we make, the opinions that we have are based upon your experiences, your perceptions. You might, for example, say, well, the inner city is less safe than the suburbs, and that could affect the scoring that you give in those two different parts of a city if you were doing a comparison of those sorts of areas. Similarly, you might be in the centre of a city and you might say, well, it's going to be nicer, isn't it, here than the inner city, and therefore there's a bias in your scoring. You're already kind of predetermining what your result's going to be. Similarly, if you're looking at different villages, you might already have a preconception of, well, this village is a nicer village than the one I'm looking at later on. So, and your scoring might reflect that. So you have to be very, very aware of the potential biases and judgments that you're making to try and avoid that subjectivity, to try and maintain accuracy as much as possible. I've already talked about the importance during group work of ensuring that everybody's working on the same standards. You have to, what we call, calibrate. You have to calibrate the judgments of quality that you're using across a group to ensure accuracy, to ensure you're comparing like for like. And finally, away from the idea of subjectivity and people's opinions and different judgments and so on, it's also very important to consider your sampling strategy. What parts of a particular location are you going to look at? So if you're going to compare the centre of the city with the suburbs, well, what part of the centre of the city you're going to look at? What part of the suburbs you're going to look at? How are you going to sample that? How are you going to make that as representative as possible? Because, of course, the area, the chosen location that you look at might not be representative of the area as a whole. So that has to be very skillfully and carefully considered before you conduct your research. Just a slide here about what we do with our results. Now, after the summer, we'll be looking at ways in which we present data, and the activity that I gave you last week was partly about thinking about the way we represent our data, the way we present our data, sorry. So what I want to show you here is a technique that we can use to display our results. If we've got two areas that we're comparing, we can do something which is called a bipolar analysis. And as you can see, we can look at these different characteristics across the different areas, and we can see how the environmental quality varies for each of these categories in a very visual way using a bipolar analysis. So in this case, we've got a case study where pupils have carried out an environmental quality survey of two different areas to allow for a comparison, and they've rated the areas in a range of categories on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score. Now what you do is you pop a little dot where on the scale where you think where your judgment is, essentially where the score is. And once you've done that for every category, you join up the dots to create this very visual comparison of the two different locations. And in this example here, you can see that two shopping centres have been compared. It could be, I don't know, it could be the Wellgate and the Overgate, for example. And we've got these categories down the side: quality shopping, environmental quality, shopping environment as well. And we can see very, very clearly from this, by immediately looking at this bipolar analysis, that Centre 2 is of a much higher quality than Centre 1, which has scored very poorly in some areas, as you can see. So a very effective way of presenting your data here, which is something we'll be talking a wee bit more about later in the course. Okay, so that was environmental quality survey. This week what I've done is I've given you an assignment task which is quite a practical activity, because I wanted to give you the chance to do an environmental quality survey yourself. So on Teams I've given you a copy of a blank environmental quality survey sheet, and I'd like you to download that. Now if you've got a printer at home, that's great, you can print it out. Alternatively, you should be able to edit the Word document directly on an electronic device, a smartphone or an iPad, and that should work quite well. Finally, if those aren't options, you could copy out the environmental quality survey sheet on a blank bit of paper, make your own survey sheet as well. But what essentially I'd like you to do is I'd like to go out into your local environment and I'd like you to assess, survey the quality of that environment. And there's a range of characteristics that I've put in place that will be applicable to both an urban environment if you live in the town, or also a rural environment if, like myself, you live out in the countryside. So there are categories in there which can be applied to a rural environment as well. So I'd like you to score for all of those categories, give your area a score overall to see how well it does, how high it scores. There are also spaces on there to make the general observations that you would make whilst you were doing an environmental quality survey. So anything that you see during the survey that is important, you would write that down. And also there's space there to talk about the general characteristics of the area. So what are the main land uses in an area, for example? You would want to put that on too. However, what is slightly different about this environmental quality survey sheet is that there is a bit of space at the bottom to make an assessment as to what improvements could be made in the area, in your opinion, on the basis of what you've seen. So normally those sorts of interpretations wouldn't happen at data collection stage. You would wait till later on when you were analysing your results before you made that sort of interpretation. But I'd like to give you a chance to really think about the information that you're collecting and therefore make that type of inference from what you've seen. So to give you an idea of what I'm looking for, if I was to go out into my local area, I live in a rural environment. There's only a few houses around, a couple of farm buildings in close proximity, a small country lane outside where I live. So I'd go out, I would, for each of my categories, making an assessment and I would score that. In terms of what improvements could be made to the area, well, there's been a lot of people walking past where we are at the moment, and unfortunately, as a consequence, there's a wee bit of rubbish lying about. So I might mention that picking up rubbish that's been dropped by pedestrians or thrown out of cars would improve the environmental quality of the area. So that would be a good example there. Okay, so thanks very much for listening. I hope that was useful. Remember, as always, if you have any questions at all, please contact me, email me, message me on Teams. I'm always happy to help, so please let me know. Hopefully, I'll get to see you soon, and when the time comes, please have a brilliant summer holiday. Cheers now, see you soon.